All right, the last few people are coming in, but I'm going to get started. It's 1 minute after. Welcome everybody to the ODI Educational Seminar. Today we are joined by Sarah Beaubien, but first I want to cover our sponsors. We have two sponsors today. We have the ODI Floyd Bodyfelt Scholarship, and the Arbuthnot Dairy Center. The Floyd Bodyfelt Scholarship honors the contributions of OSU Professor Emeritus Floyd Bodyfelt. The scholarship supports students who have a strong interest in dairy foods. By creating this scholarship, we assume that Professor Bodyfelt's contribution will impact future generations of dairy professionals. To support the Bodyfelt Dairy Scholarship, please send a check to Elizabeth Goddick. Her contact details are available online. Checks should be made payable to the OSU Foundation. Donation can also be made online through our shopping cart. And the Arbuthnot Dairy Center was established in 2010 at Oregon State University's Food Science and Technology Department as a result of the generous donation from Paul and Sandy Arbuthnot, establishing an endowment in their name. The Arbuthnot Dairy Center focuses on training students in dairy science and preparing them for impactful careers in the dairy industry. Students do this through conducting applied research focused on solving industry challenges. The center also supports the dairy industry through collaborative innovation projects and technical problem solving locally, regionally, and beyond. And I would like to welcome Sarah Beaubien. She is the director of Quantis Incorporated here in Portland. As the U.S. Director for Quantis, Sarah leverages the power of business to build sustainable, resilient food systems and restore natural resources, biodiversity, and ecosystems. Prior to joining Quantis, Sarah spent 12 years as a sustainability lead in the food and beverage CPG companies, working at the intersection of food, farming, and policy. During her non-working hours, she enjoys exploring the local food scene, cooking, playing piano, skiing, biking, traveling, and adventuring with her family. And welcome, Sarah. I think you are a co-host and you can share your screen. Let me know if you cannot.
Great. 1 second, and I will do that. You might see yourselves for a second here as I do this. Smaller. All right. And I'm going to wait for just a second to go into slideshow mode because I'd like to get a little bit oriented on some of the Zoom features before we dive in. Thank you, Matt and ODI, for having me. As Matt said, I'm Sarah Beaubien. I'm the US Director for Quantis. We have two anchor offices in the US, one in Boston and one here in Portland. And we've got a pretty simple agenda today. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Quantis, reflect back on some of the US dairy commitments that you heard about last month with Joe and Jennifer, talk about definitions of food loss and waste, and how to tackle food loss and waste, and then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. And before we dive in, I'd just like to get a sense of who the audience is today. So using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, type into the chat where you're dialing in from today or where you're calling in from today. A couple minutes for that. And Matt, maybe you could help me out because I'm not able to see the chat right now.
I'm sorry. You can actually see the chat up at the controls at the top. You can still click the chat on those share controls. I found that this morning.
You did.
But I'll read those off to you.
Awesome. Let's get a sense of who's here.
We got Seattle, Portland, Medford, Oregon, OSU, Corvallis, Eugene, Northwest Portland, Seal Rock, Chicago, Tillamook, Olympia, Washington, McMinnville, Lockmead Dairy in Junction City, Rickreall Dairy, West Lynn, Portland, Lake Oswego, Alpine Rose Dairy from Portland, Springfield, and Portland.
Wow, all over. Well, it's great to hear. It's great to hear so many people from all over, and thank you all for being here today. So jumping in a little bit about Quantis, our mission at Quantis is to guide organizations to define, shape, and implement intelligent environmental sustainability solutions. We deliver resilient strategies, robust metrics, useful tools, and credible communications. We like to think of ourselves as, think of our work as building a bridge between the science of sustainability and business. Quantis has a long history of partnering with the food and ag sector. You may recognize some of these logos up here. We are partners with Tillamook, Dairy Farmers of America, Danone and Dannon, Arla, Land of Lakes, Friedland Campina, and Bell in the US as well as in Europe. And some of the services, our key services are life cycle assessment. That's kind of our bread and butter. We own the World Food Life Cycle Assessment Database, which is a collection of data sets for all food commodities or all commodities. We work quite a bit in biodiversity, soil health, land use change, water footprinting, and then today we're going to talk about our services and some guidance in food loss and waste. We're also really proud of our Dig In report. It's a, oh my, sorry. There's always got to be one of those during a presentation. Let's see if I can get rid of this. We're proud of our Dig In report. It's 100+ pages of insights with 11 case studies, useful infographics, and the idea of this Dig In report is to serve up guidance to decision makers at every point in the food value chain to understand the most pressing issues in the food sustainability, define strategic opportunities, and set bold environmental goals. And what I can do when I'm done is put a copy of this in the chat so that you can take it home and digest it. We also have lots of material on our website where you can orient yourself to this. So if we switch gears a little bit and take the next couple of minutes to reflect back to what you heard last month with Joe McMahon and Jennifer Block from the Innovation Center. They talked about some of the US dairy commitments. DMI and Quantis go way back. Quantis partnered with DMI on the milk life cycle assessment. You may remember that got published a few years back. So it's exciting to see some of this progress by US Dairy. Really, Joe and Jennifer focused on 3 key areas for all of the commitments, making sure that, that dairy products are responsibly produced, making sure that there's continuous improvement, and then nourishing communities. So it's great to see all 3 of these focus areas have emerged and across the industry. And you also might remember this slide where Joe explained that in order to come up with these commitments, they first went to a global view for the Sustainable Development Goals, then narrowed in on the sustainability framework for global dairy, and then a more local view for US dairy. And we'll come back to these Sustainable Development Goals in a couple minutes, which is why I think it's just good to reflect on what the thought process was for the US dairy. And then you might remember this very bold, audacious goal in the 2050 commitments to become carbon neutral or better. And that goes for both processors and for farmers. And this is really important, and I'm so glad to hear that U.S. dairy is a leader in this effort, because the global food system is responsible for almost 28% of all greenhouse gases. And the transformation of the food system is one of the strongest levers we have to prevent global temperature rise, protect food security, and ensure that the food and beverage sector continues to thrive in a resource-constrained world. So maybe you're wondering, or maybe you were wondering last month, how can I make an impact against this? So today I'm going to walk you through one way that you can begin working to lower your GHG emissions, which is food loss and waste. So what's great about focusing in on this area of reducing food loss and waste is that it's a triple win, and it kind of goes back to those three main areas for US dairy. It saves money for farmers and companies and households. It makes more food available to those in need, and it reduces the pressure on climate, water, and land resources, which are increasingly constrained with our growing population. Around a third of all food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted from farm to fork. And to me, this is just such a great tragedy, because I know how hard people work to make the production of that food possible. This is a huge inefficiency for the economy, for social, and for environmental impacts. And food that is ultimately lost or wasted consumes about a quarter of the water used by agriculture, requires the land the area the size of China, and is responsible for an estimated 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So, and economically, food loss and waste causes about $940 billion per year in economic losses. It's just staggering. And it exacerbates food insecurity and malnutrition. So the 8%, just to be clear, includes emissions also from the growing of the food that's just thrown away. So getting into what actually is food loss and waste. The food loss is the decrease in edible food mass in the production, post-harvest, and processing stages of the value chain that leads to edible food for human consumption. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part, food waste, is food loss that occurs at the end of the food chain during retail or final consumption. Here's another way to look at it, depending on how your brain works. We start with food, plants, and animals, and then those get further divided to food that's edible and food that's in the parts that are inedible. Hopefully that food is consumed, but if it's not consumed, it can be divided into the not consumed and the inedible parts, and the possible destinations kind of become one and the same at that point. So depending on how your brain works, this might be an easier way to look at the definitions of food loss and waste. And what's important here is that each company or operation brings a unique context to these topics. So in looking around you at what others are doing, it's important to think about how your operation is the same and how it might be different. Two of the most important things to consider in defining your strategy is what areas you can have the most influence in, and what levers you have to pull that are available to you to drive change. So just to give an idea of what some of the causes and drivers of food loss and waste along the entire value chain are, the first place it could happen, and these are just examples, there are many more. In production, the cause could be that the food is left in the field. The driver of that might be that there's a lack of a buyer. In the handling and storage aspect of the value chain, perhaps the cause is that the food was degraded by fungus or disease, and maybe the driver of that is poor infrastructure. It could happen in processing and packaging, where the cause might be that there's spillage during the processing, and the driver might be that there's gaps in knowledge or lack of training. For distribution and market, the cause could be that the produce is sorted out due to low quality, and the driver of that might be that there's lack of a buyer. And then for consumption, the cause might be that the product was purchased but not eaten. And as a consumer, I would chalk that up to poor planning. So let's take a break and use the breakout feature of Zoom. And I encourage you to take a few minutes with some of your peers that are on the line today, reflecting back on the previous couple of slides. Where do you think you have food loss or waste in your operation, whether you're on a farm or whether you're a processor? Where do you see that food loss or waste may be happening? And Matt's going to move us into those breakout sessions.
Okay, you'll have 5 minutes in the breakout rooms. We've predefined the rooms into smaller groups. And I'm going to set it for 5 minutes total. It'll warn you when we hit the last minute. And here we go.
So everyone should turn on their video and unmute. Is that right? I am unmuting you guys so that we can see each other. Can you guys hear me? I'm trying to unmute you, and you need to stay unmuted so we can have our little small group here. Okay.
Hey, hey Rita, sorry, there's some background noise that's uncontrollable here.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, so did you catch our question that we're supposed to talk about during this time?
Yeah, I'm a ingredient supplier actually, so can speak for some customers on where they may be experiencing some food loss. We tend to see it definitely in processing, you know, unrecovered yield, if you will, and then a big area where you know we work with a lot of customers on is really the end of shelf life type situation.
Okay. Anyone else? Chris, Rosie, Keith, Josh?
Oh, good morning. Yeah, this is Chris Jackson. Actually, I'm on the CNS side of things, cleaning and sanitation. But the reason I'm listening to this is because my wife's Kenyan, and I've talked to her uncle who's does a lot of things overseas in third world countries, and one of the biggest waste is, you know, the food supply. They produce great amounts. They a tremendous amount of waste. So I'm really interested in listening to see what some of the ideas are. Plus, I'm driving, so I probably shouldn't be communicating too much. So, but thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Keith. So I work for Tetra Pak. So we're throughout the value chain on the food side. So I just want to understand the work that's being done and how it's being organized and the resources that are out there.
Okay. Josh, do you have any input, or Deborah?
Yeah, sorry, I was in Zoom purgatory for some reason, but yeah, I'm with the Oregon Dairy Nutrition Council. I've been there about 5 years, and we realize that especially in the Pacific Northwest, consumer expectations are that we not only provide delicious and safe products, but do it in the right way. And sustainability is at the heart of that. So we're really prioritizing storytelling, and you know, we believe it's something that dairy farmers were the original sustainability experts, and something they've always done, and that they're innovating for the future. So it's all about building understanding, trust, and supporting trust and sales for the future.
Okay, it looks like we're coming back to the main session. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, Sarah. I'm not sure if I need to make you a co-host again.
Oh, okay.
Are you able to share your screen? Yeah, you're still a co-host, so you can share your screen. Welcome back, everybody.
Sorry. You guys, can you hear me, Matt?
Yeah.
Okay, I just need to share my screen. All right.
Yeah.
Can you see that? Okay. It kind of garbled everything up when we switched back. So welcome back. I hope that conversation was fruitful, and that you were able to discover maybe a perspective other than your own about where others are experiencing food loss and waste in their operations. I know we have some farmers on the line, some people that are within a processor, and then others who might just, with your job and your day-to-day, might be consumers and might be aware of some of the waste that is happening just in your refrigerator or in your kitchen. Let me switch here. So next, let's take a little bit of time to talk about, we all know that there's food loss and waste in the systems. What can we do to start tackling that? So I recommend a three-part approach to tackling food loss and waste. First, committing. So, you know, saying out loud to your employees, your family, your operation, that you're going to commit to, you're going to access some resources and some data to help develop a baseline and some appropriate targets. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the places you can go to do that. And then the second thing is measure. There's the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so I'm going to give you some ideas about some calculators and some different ways that you can be measuring food loss and waste within your operation. And then finally, act. So gaining insights from what you've calculated and the targets that you've set, how can you look across your operation? If you have multiple regions, look across those regions. And then some of you on the phone might even have multiple countries that you could be looking at to take action. So the first thing is to chart your course. It takes a real mindset shift to shift from traditional business as usual to be thinking in terms of food waste. So in the past, we've relied on SMART goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. We encourage you to go beyond that and to be thinking smarter. So setting your goals based on science, having influence where you can, both within your own operation and then also looking into your supply chain, being ambitious, setting a goal that's going to push you past where you might be today. Typically, SMART goals are ones that are reachable. You want them to be relevant for your business, and that's where it comes into play that each business is unique. You can look at the people around you for ideas, but make sure that you're bringing those ideas back to what your operation looks like. Make sure they're timely, make sure they're earthbound, and that you're reaching out and asking for help. So when you adopt this mindset for your targets, it will push you farther faster. So you might be wondering, well, how the heck do I do this? Where do I go to look for ideas for how to set goals? So there's a couple places that you can go. One, referring back to the Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned earlier, that Jennifer and Joe referred to as far as how they set the US dairy goals. There's a lot of materials available through the Sustainable Development Goal Champion website. And waste actually falls under goal 12, which is the responsible consumption and production. It's 12.3, and it's to by 2030 have per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce all food losses along the production and supply chains, including post-harvest losses. So if you dive into Sustainable Development Goal 12, you'll find 12.3 that has some specificity about that. And then also it helps with this goal 2, which is zero hunger. As we talked about, when you start working on food loss and waste, it's a triple win. It's an economic savings, it works towards zero hunger, and it also works toward reducing your greenhouse gases through that effort. The other place that you can go is the World Resources Institute Food Loss and Waste Protocol. There's some great ideas there. And then also the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has in their through their website has the Food Recovery Challenge, it's called. So I've put these links down below, and when I send out the slides to ODI, they can share these with you, so you can go check those places out. The second step is to measure. This is where the step where we can identify hotspots, we can measure progress, and then we can look ahead at the action. So once we have our orientation, we can assess the terrain and determine our pathway. So once you've gone to those sites and kind of decided what you're going to commit to, then you can start to measure. This requires taking a deep dive into the data and developing a strong action plan. Measuring and being able to talk about our progress on these issues requires stronger data systems than we're probably used to, but the systems are rapidly developing to get better and better. One calculator that is available is called the Food Waste Atlas, and this is developed by two organizations, the World Resource Institute and WRAP. And the Food Waste Atlas is the world's first global repository for food loss and food waste data. It enables, whether you're in government, whether you're with a company, or you're a researcher, it allows you to find and report on food loss and waste. And it's across the entire value chain, and it allows you to search by type, by food type, by country, and by stage in the supply chain. Again, when I send out these slides, you'll see the website listed at the bottom. The other tool is a tool that Quantis created with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and it's called the Food Loss and Waste Calculator. It provides a snapshot of the environmental and nutritional aspects associated with the loss of food and the waste of different types of food. And this can help you prioritize different food and waste streams. What's important about this calculator is that measurement is the first step, but not all foods are created equal. the numbers only tell part of the story because the types of food can vary significantly depending on how many resources were used to create them from seed to plate, and how what the different aspects are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Also, caloric and nutritional content is really important. So this calculator helps with that. So for example, equal amounts of beef and lettuce do not have the same impacts or nutritional value. So for example, a ton of beef contains 2.5 million kilocalories and has a carbon footprint of about 30,000 kilograms of CO2, whereas a ton of lettuce contains 150,000 kilocalories and has a carbon footprint of 200 kilograms of CO2. But it depends on how much you waste. So if you waste crates and crates of lettuce and one piece of beef, then you want to consider the amount of each of those two. So the calculator allows you to calculate not just the amount of waste, but what are the calories and the nutritional value associated with that waste. And then it allows you to explore your options. So what are the different scenarios that where the food loss was created? So one of the additional things that it provides some guidance, and it allows you to prioritize and screen for questions related to the things on this slide. So what is the region? What was the food type? What was the destination where that food was going? Which stage of the life cycle was it in? And again, what is the nutritional value? And then again, just repeating what I said before, not all foods are created equal. So it's important to weigh those things and not just do it pound for pound. And then finally, the last step of the process is to act. Some people like to think of this step as innovation. It requires you to dive into your supply chain. For food products, most of the production process is happening on farms, and this is where many of the aspects of quality, nutrition, and sustainability are determined. There are ways to embed sustainability into the heart of your R&D efforts and start to think about eco-design, and also packaging is really important, especially with this, the media coverage of ocean plastics. There's this sort of evil stamped on packaging, but as we know in the food industry, that packaging is actually key to avoidance of food waste. If it's keeping that food away from air, light, it actually could be the best thing to be able to avoid that food waste, which is much more impactful long-term for the environment. Acting and innovating might be beyond your control zone. So if you've done everything you can within your operation, how can you influence your partners either upstream or downstream to be able to start making a difference? So that's the final step of the commit, measure, and act framework, and some ideas within each of those frameworks to be able to get started in your own operation on minimizing food loss and waste. And I'm excited to open up the rest of the time for some Q&A from all of you.
Great. And in the participants panel, if anyone can raise their hand, and we'll call on them and they can ask a question.
Can you quit sharing your screen? Yeah.
I'm going to. Thank you, because I can't see.
Raise your hand if you're sharing.
I see Lisbeth has her hand raised.
Lisbeth has her hand up. Go ahead, Lisbeth.
Okay, this is just a quick question, Sarah. When you talked about setting goals aligned with science, make sure they're earthbound. What does that mean?
Meaning that they're grounded and that you're thinking about how to tie it not just to your operation but to the environment is really what that means.
Okay, thank you.
So literally tied to the earth.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And the floor is open for any more questions. Sherry, did you want to ask a question?
Yep, I will. It's faster than finding the raise your hand. It was a great presentation. Thank you so much, Sarah. One question, and my apologies if I missed this, is it necessary to do a life cycle analysis to really start to quantify where you have waste lost and how to set priorities, or are there ways for companies to step into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives you, it certainly sets a baseline to be able to look within, there's product LCAs, and then we can also take a life cycle assessment, a life cycle approach to a footprint where we look at the entire corporate footprint from all the way from the farm to end of life. So you can get a nice view of either the product's impact or your corporate impact or your operational impact by using one of those tools. But if you just want to focus in on food waste, you could use one of those calculators to just dive in and start measuring and start setting actions based on that. So while I don't think it's necessary to do an LCA or a footprint, but it can be super helpful to just get you started on figuring out where your hot spots are. And if even food waste is a hot spot for you in your operation, it might not make sense from an investment and energy standpoint if food waste doesn't even show up on your footprint. There might be other things that are more worthwhile and more value added, more bang for your buck to work on. And so that's what an LCA or a footprint would allow you to see.
Thank you, Sherry.
Good question.
Elizabeth had another question.
Yeah, sorry. And Sarah, I forgot to mention, this was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, of course, my pleasure.
I was sitting through the presentation wondering how I can have my students use those calculators in their daily life to look at opportunities for controlling waste. Are you familiar with some nice exercise that I could do for college students in this regard?
That's a good question. I haven't looked at it. The WRI tool is definitely designed for researchers. And so there might be a component of that where you could use it in, I'm assuming, in a research facility or for academic reasons to be able to use it in a little bit different way than a company would use it or a farm. Yeah, I'll look for you, Elizabeth. I haven't come at it from that angle, but it's a really good question. And I would imagine that it's adaptable, but I'll take a peek.
Okay, thank you.
And when I send the presentation and you can go to that link and it's, prepare to go down a rabbit hole because there's a lot there and you'll uncover a lot, but I'll see if I can find anything specific about that.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I can't quite figure out how to raise my hand, but this is Keith with Tetra Pak.
I was wondering about that.
But
go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I had a question. Have you run any specific analysis around a dairy processing plant or around a fluid dairy or a cheese plant?
We have done a lot of work with those brands that I flashed up on the screen in the beginning. We've worked with different companies in different capacities. We have done review of whole dairy operation, and we have looked at product LCAs to look specifically at the impacts of that one product. So yes, we have. Do you have a specific question about?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, so if you've done the whole value chain, right, what are the top 3 losses?
That's a good question.
Or even the top 1.
We talked about, we talked in our session, in our breakout session, maybe you did too, about the loss whenever there's a transfer of the milk. There's going to be loss. And I think, that's really tragic to watch whether you're, no matter which point of the value chain you're on. That's a big one. Also within the food supply or value chain, the consumer loss is massive. And so you may say, well, there's nothing I can do about that. But one of the things that I would encourage in that final part of ACT is it might not be in your control zone, but if there's training that you can do with your consumers, either through social media, through your website, even on your packaging about ways to minimize food waste, then that is huge, because a lot of us are just not even aware of how much we're wasting and how many resources went into the production. If you waste half a block of cheese, what you're kind of throwing away along with that one piece of cheese. So the food loss at the consumer end is really big. And then I would say anytime that there's a transfer of that milk from one part of the process to the other, there's likely to be significant waste.
Thank you very
Awesome.
much.
Thank you. Yeah, great presentation.
And do we have any other questions? If you can't find the hand raise. Oh, Sherry has another question. Go ahead.
Yeah. You know, the topic of food waste on the consumer end came up in our conversation as well in the breakout, and in part related to code dating. But I wonder, are you aware of any marketing that's really consumer centric that would be useful for folks more locally around educating consumers about waste? Because I know in my past, just simple things like helping people understand different ways of using plain yogurt, for example, so that they're not wasting it. So recipes. So there are different ways in which companies potentially could help. But are you aware of any marketing? Maybe that's a DMI, kind of Dairy Innovation Center question.
Yeah, it might be a DMI question. There's a couple organizations that I'm aware of that might have materials that could be leveraged. One is called REFED, REFED, and they're doing a lot of work with consumers around food waste. The other one, the other organization that's done a lot of work on coding, on date coding, is the Natural Resource Defense Council. For whatever reason, I think it was actually one person there who kind of led the charge, but they are responsible for a lot of the improvements in that area of standardizing the date codes so that we're not confusing consumers with a lot of mixed information. And I remember hearing from them that they went into a Trader Joe's, not to pick on Trader Joe's, because I think it's common at all grocery stores. And within the Trader Joe's milk, there were, I think, 4 or 5 different ways of coding. And people, as consumers, we just don't know when it's safe. And so we see that date and we think, okay, I'm going to throw it away. But that date might be best if sold by. It's not best if consumed by. So I think that that you bring up a really good point, which is let's just standardize it so that consumers know that that date means you probably don't want to, it's probably not safe after this date versus you want to get it out of the store by that date.
Thank you. By the way, I put a link to REFED in the chat feed, and I also put a link to the DIG report as well.
Oh, good.
As well. Yep.
Thank you. I'm going to actually I have a little flyer. I'm going to put it in the chat.
Thank you, Sherry. And Elizabeth had another question. If Sarah's ready for another question.
So, yeah, I'm nearly embarrassed to ask it, but what is the argument? Because you said initially, Sarah, that 1/3 of food is wasted. Another way to look at that is we eliminated waste. 1/3 of the dairy farmers and maybe 1/3 of the processors would not have a market for their products. So can we be successful that we put our industry out of business?
We talked about this when I was at Tillamook about whether or not that the replacement of those foods that we're throwing away is important. The way I look at it with the farming side of things and the processing is the resources that you put into that are going to be the same. whether you eat it or throw it away. I think it'd be a really interesting consumer study, though, if people end up what that replacement looks like. Like, is it a 1-for-1 replacement? And I think it would be an interesting thing to look at. But would the industry also be more successful if we eliminated the food waste and we could use those resources for other things? So I think that it kind of depends on how you look at it, whether it's a good thing or not a good thing. But I think it'd be a fascinating consumer study to see if kind of what that replacement pattern actually looks like, and if it would actually be detrimental to the purchasing habits. I don't have an answer for you, but I'd be curious about it too.
It is interesting, and I'm not in favor of waste for that reason. I'm just wondering, like you said, what is the replacement? What happens?
It's a good question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We have time for a couple more. Do we have any other questions? And if you can't find the hand, you can just turn on your video and raise your hand.
Or type it into the chat if you're shy.
Yeah, I was just gonna maybe respond on the 30% loss being a reduction in sales. It could also be, I mean, like, that's economic loss too, right, for the consumer, technically. So I mean, they would have more opportunity to spend on more higher value products potentially.
Good way to look at it.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Thank you, Keith.
I think, Lisbeth, you need to get a PhD student on this.
I actually love the idea of, I also love the idea of looking at waste across different industries at each step of the way. That I know there's a lot of work going on in Europe on that, where they compare both large scale and small scale processing and across different commodities. That's very fascinating where the waste happens along the way.
Yeah.
And the floor is still open.
Just so you guys have these links, I'm going to take the links out of my PowerPoint and just put them into the chat so they're available to you right now.
I had one more question actually around dairy. In terms of the packaging, have you guys evaluated different supply chains, you know, in the final packaging, like cold chain versus, you know, the European aseptic chain?
That's a good question. I am guessing we have, because we have an entire circularity plastics and packaging team, and we do have a calculator just for packaging that we're actually releasing in the next couple of months. So I'm guessing we have looked at that specifically, and I don't know the answer. I wouldn't be able to tell you any specific details about it today off the top of my head, but it's a really important issue to couple with food loss and waste. And like I said, packaging has become such a demon in the eyes of consumers because of the ocean plastics, but I think it's really important that we talk to people about the big picture and that the role that packaging plays in food waste avoidance, and what the different types of packaging are. I just got off right before this webinar, a 4-hour workshop with one of our clients around, and it was a breakout for 4 hours just about types of packaging and innovation, and what kind of layers are critical, whether plastic, metal, or glass are better. I mean, it's really a complex issue, and you have to look at a lot of parts of it. I mean, metals, you go all the way back to the mining, and how is that going? You know, what kinds of practices do you have in place? It's very complex, and I think there I would say footprinting work is really helpful.
Cool. And we'll have time for about one more question. Unless, did I cut you off? Keith? Did you have another question?
Nope.
Okay.
Sorry to totally
Anybody
dodge
else?
your question, Keith.
No, that was a great answer that you guys are have teams working on it. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, it looks like we don't have anybody else going once, going twice. Thank you very much, Sarah. And
Yeah, thank you all for coming. It was great questions. I appreciate it.
thank you very much. And we'll call it early and check your email for the recordings and for the announcement of the next session. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.